Hi, welcome to episode 30 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe on the channel page and give us a thumbs up in this particular episode. If you're listening on a podcast platform, please give a follow to the show and a rating to the show as well. And of course, check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries Podcast. Before we get started with the conversation, I'm proud to say that episode 30 is sponsored by, well, American Tributaries, or more specifically, American Tributaries Travel, which is the company that I started this past June to take the spirit of this podcast and put it on the ground and get U.S. high schoolers to start traveling in the country. We'll be doing our first trip in February, going down from New York City to South Carolina by Amtrak. We'll be visiting the historic, beautiful, complex city of Charleston, going up to the capital city of Columbia, and finishing up in the surgingly popular city of Greenville in the upland part of the state. If you're interested, please check out the website at americantributaries.com or send me an email at mjwhidden@americantributaries.com. Okay, on to the show. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Manu Meel. Manu and I have connected by virtue of the very inspiring and very important work being done by BridgeUSA, where he is the CEO. Manu, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Michael, thank you for having me. I'm doing a lot better now that I'm talking to another fellow traveler that's working hard on this type of stuff. I have to say that I think you call this podcast kind of like the Lewis and Clark of the 21st century in terms of an expedition. I think that is exactly right. We are on a journey. We are on an expedition, and I think one thing that journeys and expeditions scream is intellectual humility and being honest and being open-minded. And I think that is exactly the mindset that we need. So thank you for the work you're doing. And those cities in South Carolina are all cities that I've visited, and also visited your hometown in Brooklyn. And I think it is essential. So thank you. Just a quick sort of background on me, Michael, and I think you know this a little bit, but folks will be surprised to know that I had no interest in politics. I actually have less of an interest in politics now. I started off as a pre-med student. My long career of 2 years basically began in 2017 when I went to school at UC Berkeley. And second semester, while I was a pre-med student, I remember I was walking back from class, and there were these massive protests happening in the distance. Now, Berkeley protests everything, big things, small things. We have a great relationship with protest. But on that day, turns out that it was actually the largest free speech protest in Berkeley since the 60s. You had kids of all political stripes, young people, adults, journalists, everyone coalescing on campus because the speaker came to campus, and there was a lot of vitriol against him. And I remember thinking to myself, man, the amount of, pessimism, resentment, anger that a young person has to feel to leave 2 hours of class to go and protest something must mean that there's a problem. And that's where my story started. And I'm happy to talk more about what we did about it. I'm happy to learn more from you about what you're doing. But that is the moment that got me involved. It was those protests that broke the fourth wall between me being a participant in our democracy and me turning into an actor.
It's fascinating the way you say, like, breaking through the fourth wall. So for more clarity, were the people protesting this speaker, or were they protesting because they wanted to protect the speaker's right to say that? I suspect it was the former, not the latter, but
it was the former, and then it turned into both. The
Okay.
interesting thing about protests is once they start and they get really large, there's actually an interesting, fun element to getting involved in protesting. It's this very fascinating crowd psychology bias that occurs. But on that day, he was a right-wing provocateur by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos, and he's now kind of dropped off the map. But a lot of students were protesting him speaking, and then a lot of students started protesting to protect his right. And really, to me, that was, I think, the surface level issue. Free speech wasn't actually the real issue there, I think, at hand. What was the real issue is that we're at a point in our society where we are unable to understand across lines of difference, where we're unable to be disagreeable. disagreement is really important in our democracy. Disagreement is the engine for progress, but when disagreement turns into violence and it turns into a collapse of civic engagement and the levers and powers of democracy, then we're in a really tough spot. So that's how that happened. And can I tell a quick story in
Yeah, please.
relation to that?
Yeah.
So I remember I was like walking past this cafe, and this was where the fourth wall really shattered. I was walking past this cafe, and these like windows were shattered, and inside there was a TV, picture television, and on it it's a CNN banner that says "Breaking news: UC Berkeley students protest free speech." Um, Standing right next to me was the television crew filming that segment, and to me, as like a 17-year-old, I was like, "Wow, that is like democracy in action." Like usually I've been a spectator, and now we're actually a part of it. And as a family of immigrants, uh, we never think about politics or democracy. We think about like trying to make our parents' sacrifice count and go to college. So that was what really made it um, something that was very impactful and formative for me.
Wow. To me, like, I want to get to, I guess how you went from that point to, I guess, where we're going. But in terms of like the idea of like free speech and free ideas, I think that there's an I feel like what's happened is that people only feel like they have one choice, right? If somebody says something disagreeable, either you have to be silent or you have to yell even louder. And like one of the things that I've always felt was that the third way for me is that if you really are troubled by those other things, those other ideas, then you should also be looking at the underlying environment that made those ideas become attractive, because maybe they aren't healthy for a democracy, or maybe they aren't right. But if your only response is arrest them, yell at them, shame them, then we're really not going anywhere. We need to like look at what's happening to make people attracted to those ideas, because maybe in their worlds it is attractive, even if it's wrong, and we need to fix that problem. But I think people want very short-term solutions versus doing sometimes the harder work of seeing why communities, white, black, whatever the race is, whatever the socioeconomic status of it is, to find out what those problems are, to fix those so that those ideas don't take hold the way that they are. And to be honest, in a country of 330 million, there's probably every dangerous, stupid idea out there, and we cannot spend whack-a-mole with 330 million different moles. You're going to have to live with some of those bad ideas.
I think, man, I think that's such a great point. And there's actually two things that I would sort of build on further. The first is what you said, the second part of that, which is that we need to actually understand why certain ideas get formed. We need to look at the socioeconomic circumstances, the backgrounds of the people voicing those ideas, because those root causal issues are really the substance in the flashbang, of our politics. Um, what you're asking there, Michael, is nuance, and along with time, it seems like nuance is an extraordinarily scarce resource these days, because nuance takes time, it takes energy. We live in this moment where I think like everybody just wants quick answers, instant gratification. What does my side think? And that is what I believe. And I think in that process, we give up our agency to be independent thinkers to those that are in power. And the second thing you said there, which is I think fascinating, is you said that you either, when a bad idea confronts you, you either become louder or you disengage or you become silent. And I think that is actually the heart of what it is that I fear, which is that we're increasingly living in a democracy where people are either hyper engaging in ways that do not add productive progress to democracy, or they're becoming apathetic and disengaging. And I think democracy depends on what it is that we put into it. And if what we're putting into it is apathy and hyper engagement, then that's like filling your car with diesel. It's a real problem.
Well, one of the things that I'd say, and I think this goes, I think the importance of what BridgeUSA is doing, and then we should certainly talk about that, is my sense, and I've been trying to have these unvarnished discussions with anybody and everybody, regardless of background,
Mm-hmm.
politics, wherever you live, is that I think people are really exhausted and tired, and my world, it stretches pretty far, like from people with like lots of money to like not that much money, people who are religious, people who aren't. I've been trying to stretch my bubble out, and it's certainly still very limited. But I think people are looking for the sanity that's out there. And I think from what I've seen, and you've been involved with politics now, whether you wanted to or not, is that feels like there needs to be cover for other people to start do something, because nobody wants to be take that first step. And I mean, I guess in
Well,
some
let me ask
respects,
you
I
this,
want
Michael. Why did you take the first step?
because the days after January 6th were the most scary days of my life. And I felt very uprooted. I felt very adrift. I thought our country was adrift. And I think the other part, though, is I felt culpable. I felt that we've lost touch with a lot of what was happening out there. And I think while people that trespass on the Capitol, or encourage violence or plan bad things, should be held accountable, I think as a society we need to ask why people would be so upset, disillusioned, unengaged, or not participating in the country, to where invading the Capitol, or causing violence on the streets during otherwise peaceful protests, seems to be an attractive, viable, okay option. And I think I was just like, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm not contributing to the negativity. I might feel it sometimes. I might say it sometimes regardless, but I want to do the best that I can to be kind of contributing something more positive to where we are. And if I'm honestly, if I'm going to die on a hill, I'll die on this hill,
Yeah.
because I think there are bad people out there. There are bad people on both sides, wherever those sides are. But I believe, based on all that I've seen, there are so many good people out there, even people who I might disagree with fundamentally on what people would consider important issues, because there's also a lot of different important issues.
Yeah.
So I guess with that, I think that what you guys are doing on campuses and colleges and high schools gives people, I think, license to to speak their minds, because you've come out before that. So what were the stepping stones for you, from going from pre-med student at the Berkeley protests to now being the CEO of of an important, I think, new kind of, I mean, I don't know if it's a political or super political, or maybe just say civic organization.
I'll say three things, two of which don't actually answer your question. At
You
least
are a
I'm honest.
politician.
At least I'm honest.
Yeah.
A politician would say that I'm not.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
And the third one that directly answers the question, but the first two are really relevant, and the first one especially because of the question I asked you. I mean, one thing that I am so incredibly grateful to you for is actually. Leaving the life that you already had to pursue a totally different track because you're awakened by a problem. I think that journey is what has both defined the story of America, but I think it's an example that people need to look to. And so I'm grateful to you, and I hope, and I am seeing this across the country of people in intergenerational contexts and socioeconomic contexts that are jumping in. And the other part of that is something you said there, which is that we need to give people the license to engage. I don't think the problem that we face in our democracy is one of demand. I think people want nuance. People want to be asking those hard questions. People want a politics that solves their problems, and they don't give a damn about polarization. They don't want that to be there. They want empathy. They want to listen. I think the issue is that there isn't any social incentive in our society to be leading with empathy and problem solving. And there's every incentive to divide. If you wanted to run a race tomorrow as an elected leader, you know the path. It's find the cleavages, find the points of fear, and hammer those down. That's it. So I think it's an incentive structure problem, and this goes into the second point that I want to make, which is, while I might be leading BridgeUSA, I would not have been able to build this organization without some of my best friends, some of whom I actually met the day after the Milo protests, and this is where it starts for me. After those Milo Yiannopoulos protests, the next day, me and a couple of random people got together and we were like, this sucks. And with our very tiny brain and specifically pre-med oriented mindset, we had no idea what it is that we were walking into. But to your point, we were just like, we need to create a space for these people to just at least hear and understand each other. So we basically created this little space, called it Talk Therapy for Campus. And it was, let's talk about what happened. And we thought, 10 or 15 roommates would show up and dorm mates would show up, and like 80 people on campus showed up to that. And there were some of those students that had invited the speakers. Those were students that had also protested the speakers. There were some families that were injured that were there. And that was such a real conversation, man. And to me, the next day after that, we said, let's keep holding the space because people, it seems, surprised, want to listen to each other and they actually want to understand and get that nuance. And we kept holding that space. We had some amazing friends out at Notre Dame and Colorado Boulder that had created this thing called Bridge ND and Bridge CU Boulder. And so we said, let's link up. We created Bridge Berkeley. And throughout college, we realized that there was this growing appetite and movement of young people that were pretty quiet, as you were saying. Us people that want bridging are a quiet bunch, and but they were there, and our job was let's start building these chapters. And so we built those chapters. After we graduated college, we took it to about now 50 college chapters, 20 high school campuses, and the goal for us is to give every young person access to a BridgeUSA chapter. And it's not to uh, it's not to create centrism. It's not to help people paper over their differences. It's to equip people with the skills to be able to be better actors in our democracy. It's to basically provide the healthy food diet to our politics, and that's what Bridge does.
There's I think to me one of the other ways to look at it is like there are problems out there.
Yeah,
And I mean, it seems that in most respect, there's just different perspectives on the problem. Like, and almost anytime you hear about people who are trying to have a thoughtful analysis of like the debates or the trigger points that are out there, it's more just about like how people prioritize things.
yep,
And I think like the way I try to look at it is more like there's other perspectives on this, and instead of thinking like you have the only way, think about like we have to have a solution and it has to
mm-hmm.
involve other views. And like I use my family, and by no means am I a very I guess I'm trying the best I can as a parent, but it's not easy with a family of 5 to get people to agree on to be happy with dinner to get people to agree to go
You have
out
three
together,
kids.
right? Yeah, with 3
Yeah,
kids.
wow.
So it's not easy to get them to do anything. It's hard to get your building where all people like we have a building of like 69 different people, 69 different families, and to get like the building together for a meeting and get people to agree, there's always going to be some disagreement. So this idea that well we need to be able to agree on things, I think is a fallacy. That's never going to happen, nor could it ever happen, because frankly you could disagree with yourself from one day to another. So this idea that a healthy country is one where we don't have disagreement is it's something that'll never
Yes.
happen. It's not even idealistic. It's unhealthy to have that.
And it's something which is why sometimes I don't like to call our work unity oriented, because I think unity to a lot of people, or unifying, implies let's just get everyone to agree. I think really what it is that we're doing is we're trying, one, to help people understand why people might hold a different perspective than them. Two is if you can achieve a better understanding of someone that's different than you, then you can maybe arrive at a common solution. And I think three is there is so much common pain in this country. You know,
Yes.
you're talking about taking high schoolers down to South Carolina. I'm sure you'll see this, but you take African American students in the inner city and in Harlem, and you relate it to the problems that someone in rural suburbs of Greenville faces. You'll see problems related to drugs. You'll see problems related to education. Now, there might be different historical causal factors, but it is vital for us to help people realize that actually we face a lot of common problems. And so let's not let these politicians divide us and see that, and let's actually understand and build those tents. Let's build those tents, because if it is not for unifying, it's at least for getting people on the same page.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I find, like if you're going to talk about politics, right, is like, I think like if I'll use the baseball analogy, right? Like when you're in a division race, when you make the most ground is when you beat the other team. When you're going ahead, when you're the Mets and you're playing against the Braves and you lose 3 in a row, it's especially painful. But if you want to make up
I'm sorry to say
ground,
I'm a Red Sox guy.
okay.
Sorry.
Well, I'm still living on far past glory zone back to 86. But I think that to me, like there's also the idea of like saying, look, if you're going to talk about politics, the best way to make ground is to actually win over people on the other side. And I'm not, this again, this is above politics, but it's just like, if I'm trying to figure out different ways to get people to think about things, you're more effective if you actually can persuade people on the other side. But the other thing that I would say, and I don't know what you've seen, is that like from the New York perspective on things, you would think, and based on everything that is penetrated through into my world, you would think like Republicans don't care about the environment. Like that's the message that you get. But yet when I've gone out and seen people like that comes up without even talking about it. Like I talked to one of my podcasts was a Florida politician who's a Republican, and he was talking about the measures to save the manatees. I talked to, we go down to South Carolina, we're visiting a farmer who I quite sure is like a Republican, and he's talking about his concern for the environment and farming the right way and like taking care of the cows the right way and the rhythm with like nature. So there are these, what I'd say, and I'd be curious to hear what you think, is that I feel like every time I've reached out of my bubble, my
Uh-huh.
expectations are defied completely. And I see so much more commonality and so much more willingness to engage if you actually reach out with the willingness to engage. If you want to lead with one of the most divisive, contentious issues that the media wants us worked up on, of course you're not going to get there. But I could do that with my wife. Anytime I want to have a fight, I'll just say, whatever the usual triggering issue is, and then we'll never have a productive conversation. I don't always do that. I try not to.
Isn't it profound what happens when you actually talk to people? You learn things.
Yes, no,
I
it's
mean, yeah,
and
it's yeah.
and so do you? I mean, is that what you've seen? Like that's my
Yes.
experience, and what little I've done is that
Oh,
people are so desperate and so eager to connect.
not only are they desperate and eager to connect, but they're desperate to be heard.
Yes,
Um, you know, I mean, that's it. Is go out and actually talk to someone. And you don't even have to go past your bubble. Go out and ask someone that's walking down the street, what do you think? What's going on with you? And here's the most important thing is just last week, Michael, I was I've been on a tour of sort of the country, meeting different people and bring bridge ideas to different campuses and most importantly, learning. And I was at Western Michigan University, which is near Kalamazoo, Michigan. And we held a bunch of different student circles, and there were students there that absolutely despised what it is that we work on. There were some students there that were really interested, some students that were just there for the pizza. They could care less why I was there. And the number one question that I asked all of them before we even got into anything was, what do you care about most? Because when you break it down to something that simple, what do we most care about? You'll get family, community. I care about my siblings. I care about the safety of my a neighborhood. I want to get a good education. I care about getting a good job. Those are answers that apply to almost every human being on the planet, right? The problem, as you've articulated well, is that if we pay attention to what I call the conflict entrepreneurs, the dividers in society that make money off of us not seeing common ground with each other, then we are going to achieve no resolution. But the moment you step out and take agency of your own actions and you start actually listening to folks, it is profound. And let me say this, you'll meet a lot of people that you still disagree with. The fact, though, is that if we can start seeing the humanity in each other, if we can start seeing that I actually also care about my family, this person also cares about my family, well, let's talk a little bit about our families. Forget politics for a second. And suddenly you might find something that's really fascinating in that dialogue that helps you break new ground with that person.
yeah.
But here's the problem, though. Here's the problem in all this is, and this is something I wrestle a lot with, and it's something that you've touched on a little bit, is, and this is the entirety of BridgeUSA's theory of change, is we are not incentivized in society to have that dialogue. Like, if I'm honest with you, I spend 90% of my time thinking about why this stuff won't work. And the fact is that telling someone, hey, you should talk to someone you disagree with sounds like a life-sucking experience. No one is like, yes. It's like if everyone just went to the gym, we would not have 50% obesity. Like, that's the problem we face, is not that people don't know this is the right thing or that people don't want this. It's that people don't see enough of this happening. And as a result, to win in our politics, you do the opposite. So it's a very simple market incentive problem for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess like one of the key things for me is I've definitely turned off the news. Like I don't
Yep.
watch the news anymore, and I think that to the extent I don't know about everything going on, I really don't need to. And I think that to me, like I don't need to know the minute by minute progress of what's happening with the Ukraine or January 6th investigations or I don't need to know that.
You know
And I
what's
think
really funny on that, really quickly, is that
what
most people that are also always on the news and on social media turn it off the moment they're off of it. Like the amount of influencers I've met on
uh,
Instagram, and I'm like, "Do you check Instagram?" They're like, "No,"
yeah,
but they're posting on it. It's like
right.
we're being fooled.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
but I think there's also like I think it's, and maybe it's hard to, like, it's hard to turn it off, but I feel like there's so many things out there where it's just like, I was like get rich quick, but like easy solutions to problems. And they're really, at the end of the day, there's going to be 1,000 different diet fads that are going to be come out in my life. And at the end of the day, it really is just eat balanced. Like just eat a little bit of everything if you really want. You want to do vegan, whatever, you can do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, just don't go an all pork diet. Don't do an all protein diet. Don't do an all lettuce diet. Just eat a little bit of everything. Moderation across the board. I mean, and that's so simple, but people don't want simplicity. Or at least they're not being sold simplicity because you can't make money off it. It's more like, oh, you don't get enough sleep at night, but you can get an extra 20 minutes if you spend $2,000 on this sleep by number bed. No, how about you just go to bed 20 minutes early? Why don't you unplug your phone and put it in the other room
Yeah.
instead of looking at it?
We all want simple things and we want quick solutions.
Exactly. Yeah, or things you can buy, and that's what's being sold to us. And I guess like with this podcast, it's like we're not selling anything, except I'm just trying to put the idea out there that there are good people, and they're far more good people than you think. Like, have you had any, you don't have to name the schools, but have you gone to schools where you found that there was less resonance, or you weren't welcome? Have you reached somebody where it's like, what, no, that's not really for us?
Almost all the time.
Really?
And interestingly, and this is where the nuance comes up, is that our politics and our democracy is run by a vocal minority of people on both sides. And I'm not creating a false equivalency here. I'm not casting a judgment on both of them being equally evil or equally good. What I'm just saying is that the fact of the matter is that the loudest voices run our politics. So when you show up to campus, or you show up to a community, or you show up to a church, who are you going to hear first? The loudest voices. What do the loudest voices want? For us to continue sort of casting our divisions, and they want solutions that are completely one-sided and are only grounded in their own intellectual formation. So our challenge is, how do you modulate how much attention you're paying to those loud voices and get to that STEM student on campus, that science student, the person that's going to business class and they're just like trying to get an education and do better for their family, or that underprivileged student on campus that is working two jobs and is just dissatisfied and hopeless about how effective they see democracy evolving. Those are the people we need to get to. So almost in every campus will oftentimes get resistance, but that resistance has to be weighted correctly. It's like having a team of employees, and let's say one employee is just really loud and they're always in your ear and they're always casting dispersions or aspersions on someone, and the other four are just doing their work. You as a boss have a responsibility to recognize how much weight you're going to give to that person's opinion. So that's what we fundamentally face on campus. Is our job is to activate most young people, give them the support resources to be louder about what it is that you're talking about, which is, how do we get people to have a politics of nuance, of understanding, of thoughtfulness, of progress that is measured. That is what our job is. Again, it's not a demand problem. It's that people are not seeing this happening, and so they become silent about it because they feel like, well, I must be the only one that wants this.
Yeah. Well, I guess for me, I feel like, I mean, the podcast, I guess, was my own little way of putting out into the media the idea
Yeah,
of people
yeah.
having conversations to talk about this, because I don't see it. And like the thing that will like upset me, and this is why I make no apologies for not subscribing to the New York Times for months now, is that the New York Times will have like, can have a special series about whatever inflammatory issue there is, or even something worth investigating, but they don't have a sustained analysis at the good being done. Like, what about the organizations like BridgeUSA and all the others? Like, where is the sustained focus on the progress being made? And the other part of it is, I think that there's, and I don't say this like in a self-loathing way necessarily, but I say it in more of a way of like, we're all responsible, we're all interconnected, and that means that the problems and other parts like affect us, but we're also responsible for those problems in some small way. And like what I would say, like when I was in law school, I was like, that's when I was against the death penalty. And to me, the ultimate argument as to why the death penalty is not a viable option in like a civilized society is that we're all part of this society. So we're all somewhat responsible for everybody else. So we can't come down with like the most definitive like punishment, which is death. when we're somewhat tiny bit culpable also because we're all in this together, right? And I think that also goes to the other things, which is like, there's a lot of poverty in our country. There's a lot of like there's poverty in the cities, there's poverty in rural America, there's jobless, there's all these problems. And what I find sometimes disappointing is that a lot of the vibe in places like San Francisco or New York is just like people are apoplectic. Like, why are they this way? Why don't they see things this way? But there's no responsibility for the fact that if you're in one of those global nodes of influence and power for technology, for finance, for media, you've been the one creating the problems. Like, part of this is your fault. And I'm not going to say, I can't give you a direct line. I'm not going to say your study, but you're the one who's been influencing the country. You've been making all these grand decisions. You've been making millions, billions of dollars on what you've been doing. So when you see the problems out there, you can't just be like, what's going on? These people are insane. They're deplorables, as like Hillary said. You need to take responsibility for the problems and say, I don't know what I've done wrong. I need to think about this and take some responsibility and try to fix it, not just look down your nose, wash your hands, and condemn and, vilify and marginalize them. And I
Yeah.
don't know if that's what you think, but that's kind of sometimes what I feel like in the big picture has happened. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think, to me, like when I look at history, I came out of school in 93. At that point, the Berlin Wall had just fallen, and the world was opening up. And people, I think, between that and technology, we became enamored with the rest of the world, and we've been exploring it. We've been paying attention to everything out there, and we should have. We needed to, because for years there was, for decades, there was war and a Cold War and whatever else. But I think we kind of forgot a lot about the people within our own borders that we should have been paying more attention to.
Yeah. Uh, I'll add two things to this. One is, when you talk about the people that are living in some of these global modes of connection, whether it's New York, San Francisco, LA, Miami, Chicago, um, if you are living in one of those cities and you have a voice, you're among a set of the most privileged human beings to have ever existed in the history of humanity. That perspective is important because you have a responsibility. And secondly, I want to think a little bit again about why is it so hard for people, especially young people, to have the bridge mindset of empathy, listening, understanding that you and I are talking about. And I think a lot of it comes down to an understanding of what someone my age has lived with and what sort of our lived history of American democracy is. So I often talk about this, but someone my age is 23. We were born with 9/11. We went to middle school with the Great Recession. We graduated high school with the 2016 election, and we went to college with the year that is 2020. The Capitol riots, the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests. It's not a great sample size, Michael, of progress. And if that is your lived history, there's a very strong degree of not just impatience, I think, with the quote unquote system or this notion of trying to work through our differences, but there's also just this deep sense of resentment. And I think what we have to think about critically for this work to scale, because you and I can talk as much as we want about the things that we agree on, is this work has to speak to those calls for change. Why is it that a young person that's on a college campus or high school, or a millennial that is now in their third or fourth decade of life, that is moving throughout the world, why is it that for them to realize the change that they want to see in the world, they resort to a hyper exclusive form of politics as opposed to bridge building? And I think that's the battle that we're fighting. Is it's a battle of a theory of change. I think people are right now picking from a menu of options. Option one is hyper engagement. Option two is bridge building, and option three is apathy and disengagement. And I think option one and three are winning. And the question is, how do we make this appealing to those folks? And I think it starts with understanding why is it so difficult for this work to grow and scale, and why does it fall on deaf ears? And that's my assessment, I think, of my generation.
um, um, like I usually feel like you laid such a heavy question. I'm not sure that.
I'm sorry. I always look at these podcast conversations.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I guess, like, to me, I feel like I think one thing is, I don't know how to say it in a way. I mean, and because in a nuanced way, but I think there's something fundamentally flawed with like higher education, and I think the way that kind of like silos us into different and not just like into like smart or not smart, but like in who can afford to go to schools on their own, and who's going to be burdened with the debts of the college afterwards. Because I think like once you have, if you graduate from college with $100,000 in debt or $200,000 in debt, you got to work really hard to pay off that debt. Or on the other hand, if you were lucky enough to have your college paid for, you have a definitely you have a different view of the world than anybody else who either couldn't go to college or has or is burdened by those debts. And I think just, and I didn't. I was lucky. I had a full like Navy ROTC scholarship, but like I had a law school loan, and like when you have that debt, you got to pay it off. And there's pressure in the society, like, oh yeah, you got to pay off your student loan so then you can go get married and get a mortgage to pay off that loan.
Yeah.
And then you got to make money so you can pay for you put money into your 529s, and you got to pay for your 401k. And there's like this rat race or this kind of hamster wheel that we're all kind of put on, and you just put on the blinders. And like I thought, like to me, I got really sad one time because I'm like, I feel like I was told that if I'm not a racist and if I work really hard, then and I try to be a good person, that everything's good. And I think it was really like seeing 2020 and the aftermath where I was like, you know what, it wasn't good enough. And I think that that's part of the problem, is we need to kind of think about, I don't know, the higher education, but think about the way that we everybody. And I guess the other part is like people go to the Berkeleys and the Ivy Leagues and all these schools, and they think they know everything. And not just like in a bad way, but you've been told
I
you're in
can
the elite
definitively
school.
say that I came out and knew less.
Yeah.
So not only did the education backfire,
Yeah.
no, it was a great, but I think you're onto something there. And the other thing I would say is I think at every sort of different cleavage in society, whether it is the income divide or the race divide or the socioeconomic divide, I think we're increasingly as people living in two different worlds, one of two different worlds. And take college just as a case study. You know, the reason why we started a high school program is because we realized that only 49% of Gen Z, my generation, is actually going to attain a college degree. That's one in two people. You look at the number one predictor for President Trump's election in 2016, it was actually the non-college voter. The fact is that we were only reaching half of my generation, if so. And if we were only focusing on the elite schools, then we would be reaching 1% of that half. And so that's why we launched a high school program. But I think to your point, there are so many different points of division. You have the urban-rural divide. If you live in San Francisco or New York like you and I, you already live in a much different world than if you live in Greenville, South Carolina, or Lake Charles, Louisiana. If you go to college versus you don't go to college, you're living in two different worlds. If you grew up in the inner city as compared to the suburb, your life outcomes are going to be very different, at least statistically speaking. And so, given all of those structural factors, that's why I think what our work really has to focus on is not just talking about why it's important to be bridging divides, but meeting people where they are. We have to actually do some of the hard work that I think you and I are talking about, which is let's be nuanced in our analysis and assessment. And let's think through what is our market. If we're very technocratic about this and we take a very city approach, what is our market? What is our consumer? And why is it that the consumer is not buying this product called bridge building? And that is exclusively what I spend my time on. And I think the reason why I've been more hopeful now than ever is because, to your point, if you actually go out and talk to people, you realize that the market is massive. Those people are just not being heard.
Yeah. Do you how like I guess how like for I think part of the issue I think is, and I think that it's a result of like say the last 30, 50, 60 years, is I think that there has been, I think there's a rightful sensitivity to race, I think,
Yep.
compared to like 50, 60 years ago, right? Like, the 1950s in America was great if you were like a white middle class family, right? It was a golden era. It wasn't so good for a lot of other people, but like I think that what's happened is I think we've reacted to that, but I think now it almost feels like if there's a problem, it has to be race based. And I think that one of the things is like there's other parts that contribute to the problems, and sometimes the race doesn't have a part to play. I mean, sometimes it does, but there's always lots of factors that come into a problem. And when I think about like when you think about diversity, like it would be a lot easier for me to get together a social gathering of people that reflect racial diversity than it would be to reflect socioeconomic diversity. in where
Yeah.
I live. And I think it's not even to say that racial diversity and being sensitive to it isn't important. It's just
Mhm.
that there are other ways of slicing society too that we need to be a lot more mindful of. And that would include also education and training and everything else, because we can look at the Supreme Court and say it's really diverse, but how many of them went to an Ivy League school?
Yep. 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 And
So
not
how
just how many
diverse
went
is
to
that?
Ivy League school, but how many went to Harvard and Yale, which is
Exactly right.
100%.
So right. So
Yeah.
how diverse is that? And I think that's that we've shifted to a fault where it doesn't make a difference. But anything else, as long as it looks diverse, it's
Yeah.
diverse.
Yeah.
But I guess like that being said, you had said like for yourself as like as an immigrant, were you born here or were you born in India?
Yeah. So I was born in New Jersey, in New Brunswick,
Okay.
New Jersey. My parents immigrated in '97. I was born here in '98, and then in
Okay.
'99 I lived alone with my grandparents for about on and off 5 year period.
Okay.
While my parents tried to settle out here.
Okay. And then do you see in like the movement that you're creating does it reflect a like visibly, is there a diversity to it, or is it
Yes.
yeah, it
So
is.
here's the interesting point about diversity, and I think there's a lot there that I want to unpack, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of focus specifically on the question of diversity. By 2045, the United States is going to be a majority minority country. And so, for the listeners that don't know what that means, it means that by 2045, there won't be a single ethnicity or race above 50%. There will be no majority, only minorities. Whether you're a white person, black person, Indian person, doesn't matter, Native American, etc. Um, and that is very profound. You know, we just assume because we live in such a diverse society that diversity is natural, that our natural state as human beings is to be able to capitalize on our diversity, when for the last hundreds of thousands of years humans have lived in tribes that look like each other.
Yeah.
um, I'm not saying that to be pessimistic about diversity, importantly. I'm saying that to articulate that to be able to make the most of our diverse moment, to be able to make the most of being able to work with people that look different than you, we have to understand how unique that is and treat that as an ambitious task to achieve. And I think the only way you make the most out of a society that is that diverse and prevent fragmentation and ethnic tensions and a collapse into our own ethnic bubbles is for people to be able to put principles like democracy, listening, empathy above their specific race. And that I think is really important. And the only way I think we achieve that is we've got to get people to be able to talk to each other. The other question of race, I think race is actually one of the most fundamentally important questions that society faces. And the reason being is I think you're right, Michael, that you can get a lot of that diversity through socioeconomic backgrounds. Across Bridge, we go after community colleges and commuter schools and large public schools and state schools, and you'll get a large mix, not just racially, but a large mix in terms of economic divides. Uh, but the fact is that for us to be able to make the most of that, we have to be able to understand each other. And the question of race, I think, is significant because I think we underestimate the level of trauma that a lot of people in this country face. And I think the way we get there is acknowledgement. It's like a family. Again, you and I try to think about this stuff very simply. It's a family. You have 5 people in your family. 3 of whom are doing great. They love each other. They care about each other. They've only known prosperity, and the other 2 are completely left behind. They're going to have a completely different understanding of your family than those 3. So the question becomes, how do you get these 2 on the same page and make them feel valued and equal so that they not just believe that they have better opportunity, but that they materially are guaranteed access to opportunity? And I think the only way we have those conversations is by making bridge building the most prevalent theory of change in our country.
Yeah. That's and how many people like do you guys how many employees do you guys have, or like how many members, like what are
Yeah.
the I guess the numbers to give people a
So
sense of.
Yep. So we have, thank you for that question. So we have 50 college chapters, 24 high school chapters. It's approximately 74 total. We went full time in this work after graduating college in 2020. On average, every chapter has anywhere from 5 people working on that chapter to 20, depending on the size of the school, the size of the community. And then they'll each have member bases that vary from 10, 20 to 100 to 200. And every 2 weeks, thanks to the work of our amazing friend Andrew, who does all of our data work, we've been measuring that about every 2 weeks we have about 500 students that pass through bridge programming across our chapters. Uh, and most importantly is I work with some of the best people, Michael. I work with some of my best friends. I would not be here without them. And those are the same people that on that first day in 2017 came together to start that first talk therapy session at Berkeley. So I think part of the strength of our power is in the organic formation of our work.
Yeah,
But we got a lot of work to do. We got a lot
yeah.
of work to do.
Well, you mentioned, I guess, the people that you work with, and I think, one of the things that I've done is, like, I shut down my old social media handles in March or before
Uh-huh.
that, and I rebooted, and the reason was, I guess, like, multifold. One, like, I just kind of felt like there was a lot of angst and anxiety and anger that I wanted to leave behind, because I felt like that didn't reflect the same person. But I also wanted to create a new, like, echo chamber, so to speak. And I think what I found, and I guess we should use social media less, but to the extent I was going to have one, I wanted to have one that wasn't so triggering and upsetting to me. And what I found is, in, like, this new universe of this virtual universe, almost like the real universe you have with, like, the people you work with, I find more, like, nuance and thoughtfulness in it, and I don't feel as anxious. So,
Yeah.
like, I feel like there's a world out there, if you unplug from, like, the big media things that we're told we're supposed to follow. And I think this is the dangerous part, is that people feel like, well, if you unplug from those, then who are you going to go to? What crazy lunatic is going to be out there? But, like, to me, I would say to the media people, like the media industry, not necessarily the journalists, the individual journalists, but, like, the media industry, is you've created this yourself. You've been berating us with, like, yellow journalism 24/7. Everything's breaking news, one-sided, extreme, inflammatory. You're supposed to be hooked on it. You're supposed to need the adrenaline, whatever. So we're going to unplug, and yeah, we're not going to watch. I don't watch CNN anymore. I don't
and
watch
that goes
MSNBC.
specifically. It's a very fascinating dynamic that you're articulating, and it gets to the core of what I think, which is that I have a feeling that I think everyone's incentives are misaligned. Because if you had a journalist on here, they'd be defending their profession, right? They would be saying, "No, this is why. This is you guys only respond to the crazy stuff." And then you just said, "What if we unplug?" It's all about shifting the demand and incentive structures. You were
Right.
in the wine industry, right? If
Yeah.
tomorrow, like, the customers were like, actually, Michael, we hate your wine, you're just going to flip to whatever it is that they want.
Right.
And so I think it's all an incentives problem.
Right. And I think, for me, like, that, what I would say is, like, again, the individual journalists, they're trying to do the right thing,
Yep.
but it's the industries out there that are like, well, we need advertising revenue and we need eyeballs, and if you're only going to think in terms of those numbers, then we have to communicate to you in those numbers, which is, guess what? Take one more person off of your list. And
Yes,
I
sir.
mean, and I think the more that's out there, the better. But I think, you guys are doing such great work, and it's heartening to know that you're out there all the time talking to people. And is there any kind of, before we wrap up, because I know you have to get going in a few minutes, has there been any, like, especially, I don't know, like, have you seen, like, witnessed yourself, like, any people kind of like just kind of, like, transformed, or kind of go through some kind of, like, experience with, like, I never thought of it that way. I couldn't believe I'd be friends with somebody like this, or I couldn't believe I would have a good discussion with somebody like that. Can you share a story like that?
All the time. I live for those moments, and those moments are hard to capture in data, but those anecdotes are what keep me going. I'll give you two examples. One is actually of you. And I'm not just saying this in terms of, like, flattery. Like, you would ask me also before this, like, what gives me hope. Uh, for me as a young person, this is easy to do. Uh, the social safety net that you have in college to take risks and fail is tremendous. I don't take care of a family. I take care of myself. And that I do a terrible job of doing as well. I have zero risk for getting out there on a limb and doing something that I believe in. And you're doing this with 3 kids, a wife, living in Brooklyn. You're taking a real risk because you found something that dissatisfied you and you got involved. And stories like that are not only tremendous, but they need to be highlighted. Another example is, and that's, I have so many of these examples. I'll give you the most recent one. Western Michigan University. I was there, and there's a student who didn't even want to show up to our event. I roped her in because I was like, "Hey, there's free pizza here. You can't give up free pizza. I know you as a college student. Get some food. You can even leave the moment this pizza's done. But I've got like 5 minutes to, like, talk to you about this work." She came in highly skeptical, very apathetic about the prospect of democracy. She feels like those that are polarizing us have already won. On that dinner, we talked about some of the problems that she'd articulated. She used to be in the Navy. She was older than a lot of students. She was a non-traditional student, and she articulated, why do we need to be involved? Why do we need to get engaged? We talked about some of those deep fears. The next day, she came to breakfast, and she wasn't forced to. Disclaimer. And she showed up to breakfast, and there she actually led the conversation for everyone. She was highly introverted first day, and day two, she was engaged. She was interested, and it's because almost all of us want this, but this is basic human nature stuff, man. It's people need to see that this is happening, and then they get engaged, and that is the most profound and powerful thing. So there's examples all over the place, and importantly, I want people that are listening to this to get out there and talk to someone. It's not that hard. You don't need to read a newspaper from New York to understand what's happening in your community. Go down to the local market, and you'll learn a lot.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I guess to wrap up, I'd love to ask you. I guess in this, you may have just answered this, but like, what gives you hope at the end of the day? Keeps you going every day.
I'll give you a different answer because the last one was stories. I was doing some Googling about this, and I was just curious. So the United States, Michael, is going to go through its 250th birthday in 2026, which to me, as 23 years old, I'm like, holy shit, that's a long time. And actually, I was like, well, let me see how long other societies that we look up to have lasted or other long empires. So I was doing some Googling and I found this. So the Chinese Empire existed for 1700 years. The Roman Empire exists for 1200 years. Athenian democracy exists for 250 years. We're not at the end of the American story. We're literally at the beginning. Depending on the size of a book that you read, we're either in chapter 1, 2, or 3. This is the start. And the more and more we start thinking about us not inheriting a system, but being creators and leaders, the more agency we give ourselves. So we have to change the frame. We aren't living in a stagnating society. We're living in a society, and we're living in the most ambitious experiment in the history of democracies. And so if you have that perspective of a long run of time, we're just at the start. And the challenges that we're facing are not only natural, but unique. We're going to be the most diverse country in the history of democracies. We're going to be the most technologically advanced. We're going to be the most racially diverse. We're going to be living through some of the most concentrated periods of wealth. We have the chance to build something really special. That's what gives me hope, is perspective and the everyday people that we meet all the time, but I'm sure you meet and you bring onto this podcast. And those conversations and those stories and those perspective takes are what really keep me going.
I don't even know if I have to say anything after that. That's really beautifully said, Manu, and you just gave me a good energy for another few months. So
yes, sir. No. Thank you for everything you're doing. Everyone, take a look at American Tributaries, and most importantly, check out Michael's story. You're extraordinarily authentic, and I'm so grateful to the work that you're doing. Please keep it going.
Well, thank you, Manu, and definitely check out BridgeUSA and what all that Manu is doing. And if you don't have a chapter at your school or if your kid's school, definitely get it going because I think it's changing the very soul of our country or reorient it in a better direction. So, thank you, Manu, and thank you to the listeners out there. May you go out and enjoy exploring our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility.